Edith Calloway did not advertise for a husband. She advertised for a hired hand. She wrote the notice herself in her best penmanship, and posted it in the Lethbridge Herald in the spring of 1891. She wanted someone experienced with horses, comfortable with winter, and willing to work without much supervision. She did not mention that the ranch was 3 hours east of Lethbridge by wagon, that the nearest neighbor was a Métis trapper named Fontaine, who came by twice a year, or that her husband had been dead for 14 months. And she had been running 400 acres of southern Alberta grassland entirely on her own since October. What arrived on the Canadian Pacific Rail line 6 weeks later was a 41-year-old Scotsman named Duncan Muir, who was 6 feet even, economical with words to the point of rudeness, and who had decided before he stepped off the train that he was not going to be managed by anyone, least of all a widow who had described herself in her letter as capable and direct. I have been told this story the way most good stories are told in this part of the country, in pieces over years by people who knew them. And what I want to tell you is this. What happened between Edith Calloway and Duncan Muir on that ranch east of Lethbridge was not what either of them planned. It was better. The way things you don't plan for always are. Edith Calloway had come to Alberta from Ontario in 1884 with her husband James, who had believed, the way many Ontario men of that era believed, that the West was simply a larger version of the East, only with more sky and fewer opinions. James was wrong about that, as he was wrong about several things. But he was a decent man, and Edith had loved him with the practical, unglamorous love that sustains people through hard winters and failed harvests. He died of a ruptured appendix in December of 1889, 2 days before a doctor could reach them. He was buried on a ridge above the creek where the willow trees grew, and Edith had stood at the grave in the January cold and understood, with complete clarity, that she had two choices. She could sell the ranch and go back to Ontario, or she could stay. She stayed. She was 38 years old, 5 feet 4, and had a jaw that her mother had always said was too strong for a woman. She had 400 acres, a herd of 60 cattle, 2 horses, and a set of opinions that she had kept mostly to herself during the marriage, and now had nobody to keep them from. By the spring of 1891, she had survived 2 Alberta winters alone, expanded the herd to 80 head, and repaired the north fence line by herself using a manual post driver and a stubbornness that impressed even the cattle. What she could not do was everything. The south pasture needed refencing. The barn roof had a section that moved in the wind in a way that was going to become catastrophic by October. She was tired, not defeated, not broken, simply tired in the way that a person gets when they have been carrying the full weight of something alone for too long. So she advertised for a hired hand. She was very clear about this in her own mind. She was not advertising for a husband. She was advertising for someone who knew how to work. Duncan Muir had come to Canada from Inverness in 1878 with his younger brother, and the specific intention of building something permanent. He had built it, in pieces, on a series of other men's ranches across Manitoba and the Northwest Territories, moving west by increments, taking what each place offered and leaving when it stopped offering anything. By 1891, he had spent 13 years accumulating skills and shedding attachments. He could build a fence that would stand for 30 years. He could read weather in the way that men who have worked outside their whole lives learn to read weather, which is to say, through the back of the neck and something older than thought. He could shoe a horse, pull a calf, diagnose a sick steer, and calculate the exact amount of feed required to winter a herd of any given size through an Alberta winter with enough precision that he had never lost an animal to starvation. What he could not do was talk about any of this, or about much else. His brother had married a woman in Winnipeg and settled. Duncan had attended the wedding and left the next morning. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had organized his life around the principle that other people complicated things, and the complications were not worth the company. He answered Edith's advertisement because the work was right. The location was remote enough that he would not be expected to be sociable, and because something in the straightforwardness of the notice appealed to him. Most advertisements were full of promises. Hers was full of requirements. He respected that. Edith met him at the Lethbridge station on a Tuesday in late May. She had expected someone older. Duncan Muir was not old. He was lean and weathered, and had a face that had been arranged by decades of outdoor work into an expression of permanent practical assessment, as though he was always quietly calculating the structural integrity of whatever he was looking at. He looked at Edith with this same expression when she walked toward him on the platform. Edith said, "You must be Muir." He said, "Aye." She said, "The ride to the ranch is 3 hours. I'll explain the work on the way." He picked up his bag and followed her to the wagon. He did not say anything about the distance, or about the fact that she was a woman, or about any of the things that men in 1891 generally said when they realized a woman had hired them. Edith noted this. On the drive east she explained the south fence, the barn roof, the rotation schedule for the pastures, the temperament of each horse, and the particular stubbornness of the third gate on the north side of the property, which required lifting slightly before it would latch. Duncan listened. He asked 4 questions, all of them specific and useful. He asked nothing about her, about James, about how she had managed alone, or about whether she found it lonely. Edith found this to be the most pleasant conversation she had had in over a year. When they reached the ranch, she showed him the bunkhouse she had prepared. It was small but dry, with a good stove and a shelf she had built herself from leftover barn lumber. He set his bag down on the cot and looked around and said, "This will do." She said, "Supper's at 6, he said, "I'll start on the south fence tomorrow." She said, "I know, I've already pulled the old wire." He turned and looked at her, not with surprise exactly, but with a recalibration. The way you look at something you thought you understood when you realize you understood less of it than you thought. He said, "Right." She left him there and went to start supper, and did not ask herself why she felt, for the first time in 14 months, that something had shifted slightly into place. The first week was a study in parallel competence. Duncan worked the south fence with a speed and precision that Edith observed with the objectivity of a person who respected good work regardless of who was doing it. She worked alongside him on the 3rd day, pulling wire on the far side while he set posts, and they worked 4 hours without speaking except to coordinate. At the end of the day he looked at what they had accomplished and said, "You do this often?" She said, "Every time it needs doing." He nodded. He seemed to be filing this away somewhere. The second week, he assessed the barn roof. He climbed up in the morning, spent 2 hours moving across it in a way that seemed casual but was, Edith understood, a careful systematic evaluation. He came down and found her in the yard and said, "The east section can be patched. The northwest corner needs to come off and be rebuilt. You've got maybe 1 more winter on it as it stands, if the winter's gentle. If it's not gentle you'll lose the section before January." Edith said, "I know. That's why I hired someone who could rebuild it." He said, "I'll need lumber." She said, "There's a list started on the kitchen table. Add what you need." He came inside for the first time. He stood at the table and read the list she had already started, and she watched him add 3 items in a handwriting that was unexpectedly careful and even. He set the pencil down and said, "You've already priced out the lumber." She said, "Last month. I wanted to know what I was dealing with before I hired anyone." He said nothing, but he took the list with him when he left, and that evening after supper she heard him outside checking the measurements again, because he wanted to be certain before he ordered. She did not smile. But it was close. The conflict, when it came in August, and it came the way most real conflicts come, not over something large and obvious but over something small that was actually large. Edith had been handling the cattle records herself since James died. She had a ledger, maintained with the kind of exactness that comes from knowing that you are the only person who will ever look at it and that any error is an error, no one will catch but you. In August she discovered a problem with the count. 17 head had been moved between pastures over the summer, and somewhere in the accounting of that movement she had miscounted by 3. It was not a catastrophe, but it meant she did not know with the certainty she required, exactly where her herd stood before winter. She spent 2 evenings going back through the ledger before she found the error. She corrected it. She said nothing about it to Duncan. But Duncan had been out checking the east pasture that afternoon, and had done his own informal count, because he did informal counts, the way other people breathe, habitually and without thinking about it, and his count did not match what he believed the number to be based on the movements he had observed. He came in for supper and set his hat on the hook by the door and said without preamble, "I count 81 in the east and south combined. Your ledger shows 84. Edith put the bread on the table. She said, "I know, I found the error last night. It's corrected." He said, "What was it?" She said, "A transposition in July. I moved 6 from the south pasture in 2 trips and recorded the second trip twice." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have caught that. I was there for both trips." This was the thing he said that Edith was not expecting. She had expected him to accept the explanation and sit down and eat. She had expected him possibly to make some remark about the value of double-checking, which she would have accepted without comment because she would have known he was right. She had not expected him to say that the error was partly his. She looked at him. He was standing at the door still, and he was not looking at her with blame or with the particular expression men sometimes got when they had found a woman's mistake. He was looking at her the way he looked at the barn roof, like something that required an honest assessment. She said, "You weren't hired to keep the ledger." He said, "No. But I was there and I know the numbers. Should have said something in July." She said, "Sit down, Duncan. Supper's getting cold." He sat down. They ate. He did not bring it up again. But the next morning she found that he had started keeping his own informal count in a small notebook she had never seen before, and he left it on the table each evening where she could cross-reference it if she wanted to. She cross-referenced it the first night. Their numbers matched. She did not say anything about this either. But she moved the notebook to the shelf beside the ledger where it would be easier to find. The fever came in late September, and it was Edith's, not Duncan's, which was perhaps fitting given that the story had already begun to reverse every expectation she had brought to it. It started as a cold and became something worse over 3 days. By the fourth morning she could not get out of bed. She heard Duncan in the yard at first light, doing the morning chores she had not done, and she thought, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a woman who has always known how to assess a situation even when she is in the middle of it. He will keep the animals alive and I will recover and we will not speak of this. But the fever climbed through the afternoon and by evening she was not entirely certain where she was, which was a feeling Edith Calloway had not had since childhood, and which she found deeply offensive. Duncan came to the door of the house at supper time. When she did not appear he knocked. When she did not answer he came in. She heard his boots on the floor and thought about telling him she was fine and decided that the effort of the lie was more than she had available. He appeared in the doorway of her room. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, steadily and without alarm. He said, "How long?" She said. 4 days, it's just a fever, go eat," he said. "Have you had water?" She had not had enough water. She knew this but had not been able to make herself get up. He went to the kitchen and came back with water, and a bowl of broth from the pot she had put on 2 days ago and not touched. He set them on the side table and sat in the chair by the window and opened the agricultural gazette he had brought in from the pile. She kept in the parlor. She said, "You don't have to stay," he said. "I know." He stayed. He came back each evening for 5 days. He kept the stove going, managed the animals and checked on the water and broth with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else. He did not talk unnecessarily. He did not offer comfort in the ways that made comfort feel like pity. Once on the third night when the fever was at its worst, she woke and he was sitting in the chair with the gazette on his knee, and his eyes closed, not entirely asleep, but resting in the way that a person rests when they are not willing to be fully absent. She looked at his face in the lamplight. 13 years of Alberta and Manitoba and the Northwest Territories had built something in that face that she recognized, because she had been building the same thing in hers since 1884. A kind of density, a knowledge of what things actually cost. She thought, "I came here expecting a hired hand. I found a person who understands what this is." And she went back to sleep. The real turning was in November, not a dramatic moment. A Sunday. Edith had been raised Presbyterian, and though the nearest church was 2 hours away and she had not attended in over a year, she observed Sundays the way she had been taught, which meant no unnecessary work and in her case reading. She had brought 40 books from Ontario. She had read all of them at least twice. She had a particular battered copy of Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped, that she had read 5 times because she found it useful to spend time with people whose problems were more dramatic than her own. On that Sunday in November she came into the kitchen in the morning and found Duncan at the table with a book. Not her Stevenson, a different one. One that had been, she was fairly certain, in the box under her bed that she had not opened since she arrived. It was a collection of Scottish poetry. She had packed it because it had been a gift from an aunt she loved, and she had not opened it in Alberta because she was not certain she had the feeling in her for poetry. Duncan looked up. He said, "It was on the shelf." He meant the shelf in the parlor. It had not been on the shelf. She had moved it to the parlor sometime in the past month without really deciding to. She said, "Do you read poetry?" He said, "Not often. This one I know." He looked back down at the page. He said, without looking up, "There's a poem in here my mother used to read." She sat down across the table from him. She said, "Which one?" He found it and read her the title, Robert Burns, a poem she knew. She had not heard it read aloud in 15 years. He did not offer to read it. She did not ask him to. But she poured 2 cups of tea and he read it anyway, haltingly, because his reading voice was not his working voice, and he was clearly not entirely at ease with it, but he read it through to the end. When he finished, neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, the November wind was doing what November wind does in southern Alberta, which is to say, everything at once. Edith said, "My husband never read poetry." Duncan said, "Most men don't." She said, "What made you start?" He thought about it in the honest way he thought about everything, like it deserved a real answer. He said, "My mother." She said, "A man who can't sit still with a poem can't sit still with himself." Edith looked at him. He was looking at the page still, at the last line of the poem, and she thought, his mother was a wise woman. And he is a man who listened to her, which is rarer than it should be. She said, "Your mother sounds like she knew a few things." He said, "She knew most things." He closed the book. She would have said this was a good ranch. He had never said anything about the ranch that was not practical or specific. This was the first time he had offered an opinion that was neither. Edith said, "She'd have been right." They drank their tea. The wind kept going. And something that had been approximately closed opened, the way things open in Alberta, not with drama but with the steady incremental pressure of a season turning. They were married in April of 1892, in the kitchen of the ranch house, by a United Church minister, who came out from Lethbridge on a morning when the southern Alberta spring was doing its best impression of a southern Alberta winter, which is to say it was trying to snow but not quite managing it. The witnesses were her neighbor Fontaine, who had come in for the occasion and stayed for dinner, and a woman named Ruth from the Lethbridge post office who had delivered Edith's letters for 7 years and felt she had earned the right to attend. Edith wore a blue dress she had brought from Ontario and never had occasion to wear in Alberta. Duncan wore the same good jacket he had worn on the train from Lethbridge, which still fit. The minister asked them both the traditional questions. They both answered with a directness that the minister later described to his wife as refreshing if a bit brisk. Duncan and Edith Muir ranched in the Lethbridge district for 38 years. They set it to 600 acres by 1905. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and all 3 of them could ride before they were 5 and read before they were 6, because those were the standards that applied in that household. The girl became a school teacher. The older boy took over the ranch. The younger boy went to Calgary and did something with numbers that his parents found slightly incomprehensible, but supported without reservation. The poetry collection lived on the kitchen shelf until Edith died in 1931 at the age of 78. Duncan outlived her by 4 years, and in those 4 years he was, by all accounts, a man who had lost the particular gravity that comes from having someone alongside you who understands what things cost and has chosen to pay the price anyway. He is buried next to her on the ridge above the creek, where the wind comes down from the Rockies in November and does what it wants, and the willows move with it, and the grass runs all the way to the horizon in every direction, which is the kind of view that made people come to this country, and the kind of view that made them stay. She did not advertise for a husband. She advertised for someone who could work, and what she found was a man who could, and something more. A man who knew the difference between being alone because you have to be, and being alone because you have stopped believing anyone could be worth the trouble. A man who had, somewhere in 13 years of moving west, kept enough of himself open to be surprised. I think that is the harder thing to find, in the end. Not capability, not even kindness, but the willingness to be surprised by what arrives after you had decided what you were looking for. Tell me, what was the moment, for you, when you knew that Duncan had stopped seeing Edith as an employer and started seeing her as something else entirely? And if you want another story about 2 people who built something better than what they planned for, it's waiting for you right here.